Hey everybody, and welcome to the third and final installment of my review of Trent Horn's Answering Atheism. When I started this series, I talked about splitting this third installment into a bunch of different installments, partially because I didn't think I could fit it all into one video. Well, I decided to go ahead and stuff it all into one video. I understand that I am sacrificing thoroughness for conciseness, such is life. This is my channel, though, and so if you want to critique me for not being thorough enough, go right ahead. And let me give you some ammunition. Section 3 makes up 47% of the book, and then the conclusion is another 3%, which I'm kind of covering in this video. So I'm covering about 50% of the book in one video. This video in length will probably be shorter than my other two videos combined, but there is a reason for that. I have touched on a lot of the responses that I will be giving here already, so I would be doing a lot of repeating myself if I addressed every single little point that comes up in part 3. Instead of doing that, I will be providing an overview of part 3, and I will respond to select portions of part 3. As always, I recommend picking up Answering Atheism if you would like to see Trent's arguments in full. Without further ado, here is an outline of the entirety of part 3. Trent proposes 5 arguments that prove the existence of God. In chapter 8, Trent presents a contingency argument. In chapters 9 and 10, he goes over the Kalam cosmological argument. In chapters 11 and 12, Trent discusses fine-tuning. In chapters 13, 14, and 15, Trent discusses arguments from the existence of moral truths, and in chapter 16, Trent discusses personal experience. Before I start my responses to these 5 arguments that Trent uses, again, in all too short time and in too little detail, I do just want to reiterate my distaste for the language that Trent opens part 3 with, which he is just repeating from part 2. Trent says that there are no good reasons to think that atheism is true. Trent does not say that there are no sufficient reasons that atheism is true. Trent says that we saw that there were no good reasons at all for atheism, as seen in part 2. Did we really survey all of the reasons for atheism that could possibly exist in Answering Atheism Part 2? No, of course not. This seems like an opportune time for the list of 200 or so arguments for atheism that Joe Schmidt from Majesty of Reason has shared in several of his videos, this list coming from Filipe Leon's blog. As Trent only went over like 3 arguments for atheism in part 2, I don't think that Trent can be so bold as to say that part 2 demonstrated that there are no good reasons for no good reasons to be an atheist. But I more or less said all of that in my last video. So now let's actually address the arguments that Trent makes in part 3 of Answering Atheism. The first of which is the argument from contingency. Maybe I've tuned my expectations for what this book is and what this book is not a little bit better now, after having finished the first half of the book, because I actually mostly liked this chapter. I will only offer a few small pushbacks. Again, this will be brief, and I welcome comments that challenge my brief thoughts on the arguments that I will present in this video. On page 66, Trent presents the argument like so. Premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence in itself or in something outside of itself. The universe does not have an explanation for its existence in itself. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has an explanation for its existence outside of itself. Premise 3, then, any explanation outside of the universe is God. Conclusion 2, therefore, God exists. So I'm sure that a lot of people with some basic familiarity of the contingency argument first thought about Bertrand Russell and how he would reject premise 1 by saying that the universe just is. Trent actually anticipates this response on page 67, which I appreciated, though I'm not fully sure I understand the glowing ball analogy thing that Trent uses to rebut Russell's assertion that the universe just is, but again, I am trying to be brief here, so I will move on with only the note that this essay on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy website does a good job at fleshing out the just isness of the universe that Trent briefly touches upon. One thing that Trent does not touch upon that I wish he did in this chapter is the idea that there's only one mode of existence, which is opposed to the position that he takes in chapter 8. Indeed, contingency arguments rest upon the truth of the fact that things exist contingently. Chapter 3 of the book, Metaphysics and the Good, Themes from the Philosophy of Robert Adams, is called The Contingency of Existence. And an abstract from chapter 3, linked in the video description down below, states that there are a number of highly intuitive principles which suggest that, after all, existence is a necessary feature, and that everything necessarily exists, and necessarily everything that could exist does exist. For the original essay from Dr. Robert Adams himself, you can check out this article, also linked in the description down below, though you will need to pay for this article if you want to view the full thing. And then lastly, I felt like Trent's reasoning for why this necessary base of all existence had to be personal, had to be a being, as Trent puts it on page 70, was underdeveloped. Why could this God that we have argued not be some kind of impersonal force like gravity or the strong nuclear force? A force, though, that just exists outside of the universe, like an extra universe gravity almost. I don't think that Trent really gave us an answer in this chapter, or indeed in this book. Those were all of the notes that I took on this chapter on the contingency argument, and so now let's move on to the Kalam cosmological argument. Trent covers the Kalam cosmological argument in chapters 9 and 10, with the formulation that Trent uses of the Kalam coming on page 74. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause for its existence. But the part that interested me the most was the part in the appendix, in particular in Appendix 2, titled Objections to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. On page 145, Trent goes over the objection that I typically raise to the Kalam cosmological argument, namely that we humans have never actually witnessed anything begin to exist. If this is the case, then premise 1 of the Kalam ceases to be unsupported, with really no evidence supporting it. If we have never witnessed anything beginning to exist, then it seems weird to insist that whenever anything does begin to exist, it must have a cause for its existence. I think that Trent has misunderstood the objection here. Let me read to you from the appendix, page 145. Nothing ever begins to exist. That's the objection. Trent says, I remember a high school theology teacher once seeking my help when one of her students challenged the Kalam argument in class. She said, I don't know how to answer this. He says that the first law of thermo shows that matter and energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but only changed. Therefore, the past is eternal and nothing was ever created. It is not true, however, that the first law of thermodynamics says that matter and energy have always existed. Yeah. So I think that, so if this student really phrased the question like that, then I think that this student was just kind of wrong. But I'm wondering if the student didn't really phrase the question like this, because this is a fairly popular objection to the Kalam. I'm wondering if the student simply wanted to say what I said, that the first law of thermo, that matter energy cannot be created nor destroyed, just kind of demonstrates that human beings have never witnessed anything ever being created, nor have we witnessed anything being destroyed. And then I want to bring up this part as well from page 146. Let me read it to you. However, an act of creation from nothing would not be a violation of the first law because it would not involve matter being created within an already existing physical system. Moreover, even within an existing physical system, the first law would not constrain an omnipotent being who could, without logical contradiction, suspend that law in order to create something from nothing, just as he could suspend the second law in order to stop the universe's increase in entropy. So, two things here. First, this would absolutely be a violation of the first law of thermodynamics, which states that matter energy cannot be created nor destroyed. If God's act of creation causes matter energy to be created, then that does violate the first law of thermodynamics. Now, maybe Trent's argument is something like, well, God created everything all at once in the beginning, and then he hasn't created anything since then, so the laws of thermodynamics are only accurate after that first moment of creation. And that kind of is the modern scientific understanding. Scientists don't think that the laws of thermo actually held in those first moments of the universe. So Trent is actually kind of onto something there, but this may have unintentional consequences. You may need to question the Genesis account, or at least admit that the Genesis account of creation is just kind of wrong, as plainly stated. In Genesis, God's creation account is separated. So first God made the heaven and the earth, and then after that, he separated the light from the darkness. Then after that, he divided the firmament from the waters. But if you want to take this view that Trent kind of outlines, I think that you need to accept that God created everything all at once, nothing on different days, whether those days are, 1,000-year increments or whether those are seconds. No, that's all wrong. I think that this argument that Trent's making would necessitate you thinking that there is no, God just created everything all at once and then that's it, we're done. Which, hey, maybe. But what's worse yet, I think, is that Trent says that God could just suspend the laws of nature if he wants. This is the definition of question begging. If I'm appealing to the laws of thermo as a way to undercut the existence of God, but then you say, yeah, but if God did exist, he could suspend the laws of thermo, that is assuming the conclusion in order to defeat my defeater. So you can't assume God's existence when I am using something to try to undercut an argument for the existence of God. That is question begging. Maybe I'm focusing too much on the appendix here, but the Kalam has already received so much attention from people who are way smarter than I am. So for now, let's move on to the fine-tuning arguments. Chapters 11 and 12 cover the arguments from fine-tuning. I have gone on record as saying that the fine-tuning arguments are probably my favorite arguments for the existence of God. And this is probably not surprising to anybody who knows me. The fine-tuning arguments are perhaps the most empirical arguments that anybody ever makes for the existence of God. And I'm a big fan of empiricism, so this is probably not surprising. And evidently, I'm in good company. Trent records on page 94 that Christopher Hitchens' favorite argument for the existence of God is also the arguments from fine-tuning. Trent says in a debate with theist Doug Wilson, Christopher Hitchens admitted that of all of the arguments that theists put forward, the argument from fine-tuning was, from his perspective, the most intriguing and promising. I agree. Now, I do have issues with Trent's formulation of this argument, and so I will offer my thoughts on how to make Trent's argument better, but first, let's start with where Trent defines the argument on page 89. Premise 1. The universe possesses finely tuned physical constants and initial conditions that allow intelligent life to exist. Premise 2. This is either due to necessity, chance, or design. Premise 3. It was not due to necessity or chance. Conclusion. Therefore, the fine-tuning of the universe is the work of a designer. The first thing that I want to point out to me would be what appears to be a black or a white problem in premise 2. I'm not sure why a fourth, fifth, or sixth option cannot be added here. That is to say that while it's true that everything is either X or not X, it doesn't seem to me like necessity, chance, and design exhaust all possibilities for why something might be the way that it is. For instance, and I know that this sounds silly, but what about by accident? What if God intended to create a universe, so it wasn't chance, but he made a mistake, so it wasn't design? That's why only tiny pockets of the universe are sustainable for life versus the entire universe actually being super well suited for life. I know that this is silly. It's not like a real option, I don't think, to like pretty much anybody, but it does show that these three options do not exhaust all possibilities. For this reason, I don't love Trent's formulation. To see a formulation of a fine-tuning argument that I like better, let's look to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, again, in an article titled Fine-Tuning, Section 3.1, The Argument from Fine-Tuning for Design Using Probabilities, which presents a probabilistic version of the argument that Trent presents in an inductive form. Now, the SEP does not present the probabilistic argument in a syllogism, but I'm going to modify Trent's syllogism in light of the SEP article like this. Premise 1, the universe possesses finely tuned physical constants and initial conditions that allow for intelligent life to exist. I didn't change anything about premise 1. Premise 2, the universe possessing finely tuned physical constants is more likely given theism than given atheism. There's the probabilistic element. Conclusion, therefore, all else being equal, and given the fine-tuning of the universe, theism is more likely than atheism. You'll notice that this formulation of the syllogism is probabilistic instead of inductive, and it's more humble. And I actually think that the humbler arguments can be more powerful than the arguments that sometimes bite off more than they can chew. I have a similar critique of Trent's response to the winning the cosmic lottery objection found on page 99. But similarly here, I think a little rephrasing goes a long way. Pastor turned atheist Dan Barker has a clever rejoinder to Leslie's firing squad. He agrees that if you survived the firing squad, it would be silly to say that no explanation was required. However, he adds to this rejoinder, suppose that you take off your blindfold and see that there's 101 prisoners and only 100 executioners. Logically, some prisoner is required to live, and in this case it was you. So special explanation is not needed. This response assumes that our universe is just one universe in a larger multiverse. And I actually do think that Dan Barker is right here for the existence of life. I don't actually think that our universe is finely tuned for life. I mean, look how shockingly little life there is in our universe. Would we say that our ocean is finely tuned for the existence of wedding rings? Sure, there are wedding rings in the ocean from people who've drowned or, hopefully just lost them on the beach or something. But the ocean is 0.0000001% wedding rings, and the universe is 0.000000001% life. But then Trent goes on to talk about the same physical constants that he talked about in the previous chapter: gravity, the strong nuclear force, etc. So I think it's actually more accurate to say that the universe is finely tuned to the existence of matter. Matter couldn't exist if the strong nuclear forces were a certain percentage different, since nucleuses couldn't form. That kind of thing. And matter really is everywhere that we look, even in between galaxies. Sure, there are light years between galaxies, but there is actually matter between them. There is something called intergalactic medium, or IgM, and the average density of intergalactic medium is about 1 atom per cubic meter. That is shockingly little matter, but it is there. And the fact that matter can exist is a more productive angle for somebody trying to make an argument from fine-tuning, by my lights anyway, than the angle that comes from the existence of life. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on this chapter is the multiverse thing, which Trent discusses on pages 100 through 103. I mostly agree here. I do see the multiverse angle as being kind of a lame solution to the problem of fine-tuning. So, no real disagreements there, Trent. But I won't have very much agreement in the next section, not nearly as much as I did in the first couple. Chapters 13, 14, and 15 cover the moral arguments for God's existence. On page 104, Trent makes the argument like this. Premise 1, objective moral truths exist. Premise 2, these objective moral truths have either a natural or a supernatural origin. Premise 3, natural origins are insufficient to explain objective moral truths. Conclusion, therefore, objective moral truths have a supernatural origin in God. Right off the bat, I do want to point out that this syllogism isn't valid. Even if I accepted all of the premises, which I don't, more on that later, the conclusion doesn't exactly follow. That in God should be removed from the conclusion. These premises have not ruled out a non-natural, non-God origin for moral truths. Think about, for instance, the logical laws. Most Catholics will admit that God cannot create a boulder that is so heavy that he cannot lift it, for the same reason that God cannot make a married bachelor. These laws of logic are something that appear just to be outside. I mean, they apply to God himself. So if God can't even invalidate the laws of logic, well, then it seems like the laws of logic are a non-natural thing that lie outside of the existence of God. Why can't moral truths be the same way? On page 119, Trent kind of touches on this point, but I'll be honest, I don't think that he actually addresses it. He says that numbers are descriptive, but moral facts would be prescriptive. And I think that I can see that point, and I'm still kind of left in the same spot. Both are causally inert, both could still exist in Plato's realm, or at least in some kind of moderately real way, and still have their existence not being grounded in God like the laws of logic. And I haven't even touched on my main disagreement here yet, which is just that I don't accept premise 1, that moral truths exist. And Trent does touch on this briefly on page 111. Trent kind of seems to admit that this is like a totally valid move. He just calls it a, quote, big sacrifice, since, quote, most people, even professional philosophers, are moral realists. Trent is right on there that most philosophers are indeed moral realists. According to the Phil Papers survey, around 62% of philosophers are moral realists and only 26% are moral anti-realists. Some people get mad at me for pointing out that nominalism is more popular than realism, and so I think I do need to tread carefully here. Maybe Trent should tread carefully as well. On my video titled, Yes, Brian, Nominalism is for Real, user Ubermensch4304 said that arguments from authority appeal only to men of little intelligence who must outsource their thinking to others. I wonder if this guy thinks that Trent Horn is a man of little intelligence. Anyway, I do think that the appeal to authority is a valid move to make insofar as someone is trying to demonstrate that a view is reasonable. Sure, appeals to authority do not prove things to be true, but it can serve as evidence that a view is reasonable. I do feel that way about moral realism, that moral realism is a reasonable position to hold. I do not think that all moral realists are irrational or anything of the sort. I think that they are wrong, though, for the exact reason that Trent highlights, coming from Muehlhauser and Mackey. And Trent more or less doesn't respond to Mackey or Muehlhauser. He instead just says that rather than giving up morality in order to embrace atheism as Mackey did, I contend that we should simply give up atheism and embrace objective morality with its foundation in perfectly good God. He then goes on in the next 2 chapters to outline why morality can't be grounded in methodological naturalism, which is like fine and all that, but it says nothing to the people who agree with Mackey. So Trent doesn't really defend premise 1 outside of an argument from intuition that he makes on pages 106 and 107. As always, I suggest the work of Dr. Lance Bush for more on moral anti-realism. But let me move on now, since I am trying to keep this video a more reasonable amount of time, to the final argument in part 3 of Answering Atheism by Trent Horn. Chapter 16 is titled, What About Personal Experience? This is the final chapter of the book, and it's quite short at only 5 pages. Trent mostly downplays the role of personal experience in apologetics. On page 129, Trent says that for theists who hope to, convince atheists that theism is true, it is important to augment our personal experiences of God with objective evidence, like the kinds presented in the previous chapters, which all people can examine and judge for themselves. Trent does go on to say that even if most believers do not know these sophisticated arguments, the arguments still fulfill their goal in showing that God exists. Furthermore, if God exists, then belief in him is justified since God is able to reveal himself to people in a personal way apart from studying arguments. So Trent's saying that like you're not irrational for believing on personal experience, but it's probably not a good way to convince other people. I pretty much agree, and I do think that Trent is tailoring his book to his audience. His audience is people who want to convince atheists that theism is true. But I've gone on record as saying that I think that the easiest way to convince me would be my own Damascus Road experience. It seems like it is not metaphysically impossible for God to give me an experience that was so real to me that I would have no real option other than just to know that he exists, in the same way that God could just poof a puppy into my lap right now, and I would just know that the puppy exists. Trent ends this chapter, and the book for that matter, on an interesting note, a note that I really liked. And I thought it was maybe more agnostic than Trent probably intended. But I would like to read that final page. It's final page and a half. Because I think it's really quite good. It starts on page 130, taking it on faith. To close my case for theism, I'd like to share one of my favorite movie scenes related to faith. In the 1997 movie Contact, actress Jodie Foster plays Ellie Arroway, a researcher for SETI, the government program that searches the universe for intelligent life. One day, the SETI team discovers a radio transmission from deep space that contains instructions to build a transporter device. Ellie is selected to go through the transporter and meets the aliens on the other side. When she returns, she discovers that, from all appearances, she never left Earth. What felt like 18 hours in a distant galaxy was in reality only a tiny fraction of a second on Earth. She has no objective evidence that the journey to the other side of the galaxy even took place. She is brought before a panel of her peers and the intimidating National Security Advisor Michael Kitts to answer for the project's conclusions. Ellie is an atheist who throughout the movie has mocked people who believe in things because of unscientific faith-based reasons. So, the first question she is asked drips with irony. Panel member: Dr. Arroway, you come to us with no evidence, no record, no artifacts. Only a story that, to put it mildly, strains credibility. Over $500 billion were spent, dozens of lives were lost. Are you really going to sit there and tell us that we should all take this on faith? Michael says, please answer the doctor question. Michael says, please answer the question, doctor. Ellie says, is it possible that it didn't happen? Yes. As a scientist, I must concede that. I must volunteer that. Wait a minute, let me get this straight. You admit that you have absolutely no physical evidence to back up your story? Yes. You admit you very well may have hallucinated the whole thing. Yes. You admit that if you were in our position, you would respond with exactly the same degree of incredulity and skepticism. Yes. Then why don't you simply withdraw your testimony and concede that this journey to the center of the galaxy in fact never took place? Because I can't. I had an experience. I can't prove it. I can't even explain it. But everything that I know as a human being, everything that tells me it was real. I was given something wonderful, something that changed me forever, a vision of the universe that tells me undeniably how tiny and insignificant and rare and precious we all are. A vision that tells us we belong to something that is greater than ourselves, that we are not, that none of us are alone. I wish I could share that. I wish that everybody, if only for one moment, could feel that awe and humility and hope. After Ellie's testimony, the movie ends on a mysterious note. The video from Ellie's headset camera recorded only static and none of the visuals of her trip across the galaxy. But Kitzman is intrigued that it recorded 18 hours of static. Still, for such an extraordinary claim, the evidence is inconclusive. I think that this is the position theists are in when they share their faith. We have an amazing experience like Ellie Arroway that we too would be doubtful of if we heard someone else describe it to us. And we also have very strange coincidences: the existence and beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the existence of objective moral truths. This evidence is not so obvious that people are irrational if they reject belief in God. After all, many atheists are intelligent, moral individuals. But I do think that these atheists may not be giving these coincidences their fair consideration. Maybe all of these lines of evidence come together so that, in the words of G.K. Chesterton, we can see that coincidences are nothing more than spiritual humor. After that, there's just the conclusion and then the appendix. I won't be reviewing those in a video, but I may review something else from Trent sometime in the not too distant future. I misspoke in my first episode when I said that Trent has never published anything peer reviewed. Trent actually does have one peer reviewed work, an essay on abortion. I'm going to give Trent a break for now after 3 videos in a row, but once I do revisit Trent, it might be this essay. And thank you to the Real Atheology team for pointing me in this direction. The Real Atheology team was kind enough to do so in Discord too, where fewer people would see my mistake versus if they posted a comment under my YouTube video. Did I sneak that comment in there just to flex that the Real Atheology team hangs out in my server and comments occasionally? Yes. But hey, maybe you want to join my Discord. I don't talk about my Discord much, but if you do want to join, the link is in the description down below. That'll be it for today. Let me know if you liked this content, this book review style content. I know that I enjoy doing deep dives, and I know that I needed a break from nominalism and from textual criticism of the New Testament. Anyway, thanks for watching, and until next time.